Hey guys, this is Dan with Gears and Gadgets. Thanks for tuning in. So I'm coming to you guys. I want to talk about a video that I saw and a bunch of comments that I've received on this channel relative to my Ford F150 that I have on order. And I made some comments about range on the F150, and I just got a ton of comments based on an MKBHD video, which by the way, I'm a huge fan of his. So I'm actually filming this in the garage right now because I am testing my new camera cooler case. I actually have my FLIR infrared thermometer on my phone here because I constantly have cameras overheating and it's a huge pain, and I decided to try to do something about it. I wanted to talk about YouTuber responsibility as, I guess, just producing content on this platform in general. And MKBHD, he has a following of 14.2 million subscribers on YouTube. So he put out a video recently. Ford gave him an F150 Lightning to basically do a quick first impressions review. It wasn't a long-term thing, basically brought it to his studio and let him kind of go through the vehicle and share with his subscribers a bit more about that truck. And the title of that video was "The Ford F150 Lightning is Better Than I Thought." And the main takeaway of his video was that Ford has marketed their truck to get about 300 miles of range, but MKBHD, Marquez Brownlee, he actually looked at the gauges, and on the gauge cluster, it actually seemed to have a much larger range than that, and he shared that on his channel. Now, when I watched that, I took it with a grain of salt because I understand this is a pre-production model, but I can tell you in the comments I saw on my videos that people saw that and other news outlets saw that and they ran with it, and it kind of just creates this false narrative, even though I don't think the intention was there for that to be the case. So right off the bat, again, I want to make very clear, I am a huge Marquez Brownlee as far as MKBHD, that YouTube channel. I've been watching him for years, and everything he does is, the production quality is out of this world. And honestly, the input that he provides on consumer electronics is incredibly valuable and genuine and honest. But what people have to understand, and I think this just applies to all YouTubers in general, and that's including myself, is that when we produce content and put it out here, you kind of have to remember that sometimes people are just listening to this stuff as entertainment, maybe in the background. And it's a little bit scary to me how many people came to my video to say, well, you canceled your F-150 Lightning order based on the fact it only gets 300 miles of range, when in all reality, it's going to get closer to 500 miles range. And that person watched the same Marquez Brownlee video that I watched, where he said right in the very beginning,
so I spent a few hours with it here actually at our studio.
I spent a few hours with this truck at my studio. So that disclaimer right off the bat, you have to listen to stuff as a content consumer. You can't take that as a comprehensive review, and in no way did MKBHD intend this to be a comprehensive review. It never was really sold that way. But the one quote that he said, and this is where things went off the rails as far as people that have commented on my channel, is that, quote, "I actually learned something from the
people at Ford who are walking me through the car that I haven't seen anywhere else that is definitely worth sharing."
And again, it's not done in malice, but in all reality, when he says Ford said, he's talking about the guy standing there who brought the truck, who is a marketing media rep for Ford. I think it's just something that, again, if you're paying attention to what's being said, you can kind of shake that out a little bit. But if you're incredibly gung-ho and watching that video as a consumer who's making a decision, I could see where that gets kind of sent off in a direction of being told something as a specification as opposed to being told something as a take it for what it's worth, which I totally believe is what the intent of MKBHD's content was. Now, what that Ford rep explained to Marquez is that the 300-mile range is calculated with 1,000 pounds of payload in the vehicle. So when he was looking at that dash and it was giving him a range or a calculation of 367 miles left with 80% capacity, naturally the inquisitive part of him looked at that and said, wow, this thing's already showing more mileage than what it's marketed for, and still has 20% of headroom left for additional mileage. So he went on to extrapolate that out and say, if you charge this thing to 100%, you're really looking at 459 miles, and that's where all the commenters flocked as soon as that video came out. Now, I posted my video a week before Marquez posted his video, and a couple things that's funny is that, one, people heard that and took it and ran with it as if it was fact, And two, they came to my video and they came out in droves to tell me that I was wrong and that my 300-mile range estimate is grossly underrated based on what the actuals are. But in all reality, they didn't even pay attention to the fact that Marquez's review wasn't reality. It wasn't even a test or demo of the truck itself. It was just a first impressions video. I have links here. The Drive picked this up and they reported it. They have a huge following. Foss Bites was another one that I saw, picked it up. Inside EVs picked it up. Fox News picked it up. And Electric picked it up. Those are enormous platforms that just kind of regurgitated this information. And I don't think a whole lot of people stopped to pump the brakes to look at the most important part of what that video really was. First of all, just incredible first impression video, great first impression video, but again, just a first impression video. And one thing I will say is the Drive and TFL Truck both reached out to Ford representatives who said that they are reconfirming that the truck it's intended to have a targeted EPA range of 300 miles. So Ford has since doubled back down on their 300-mile claim. So the thing that people say is, well, it was calculated with 1,000 pounds of payload in that truck, and it's important to know that. But when I hear that, I don't really know what that 1,000 pounds payload, well, there's a whole SAE, or Society of Automotive Engineers, testing regiment that happens, and that 1,000 pounds, is that payload on top of passengers, or is that 1,000 pounds of passengers? What does SAE test against for regular MPG tests? Does every other EV test with 1,000 pounds of people in the vehicle or payload in the vehicle? You have to know more information about what that 1,000 pounds is before you kind of take it and run with it as if Ford is doing something different than everybody else. That very well could just be the standard of how they're tested. I tried to look it up before I made this video, but I don't know enough about the SAE testing, so I'm gonna leave it as I don't know enough about it, and it's very possible every other manufacturer tests similarly with that 1,000 pounds. Now the next thing, and probably the most important thing to me, looking at that truck that Marquez reviewed, is that first of all, it was sitting in that parking lot. And you have to remember, these are all pre-production vehicles these guys are looking at. It's very possible that there's still pre-production firmware on that vehicle where those calculations may be reading out completely inaccurately because there's potential updates that still need to be done to get those calculations to be accurate. So still very possible the software that's on that truck is not final and that the calculation is just wildly inaccurate at the time. So you have to kind of keep that in mind as well. And then even if that were to be the final software, which I would say it's most likely not, these EVs, and not even just EVs, but gasoline vehicles as well that calculate out miles per gallon, tend to do it with historical driving data. So they look at how you've driven that vehicle over the last 50 miles, how you've driven it over the last 100 miles, and they extrapolate that out to figure out what you're most likely going to get with the mileage that's showing on that gauge cluster. That truck's sitting there idle. By the way, EV guys, stop telling me you can't say that EV's idle, because EV, the whole definition of idling is sitting still, basically not moving. You can still idle an EV. It just means on while stationary. Drives me nuts when I guess the pretentiousness around like we have to call everything something different because it's so much still a vehicle goes down the road, same idea. You can still use some of the same terms. It's just propelled differently, different fuel, that's it. But again, I digress. That vehicle that he was looking at again was just sitting stationary, and that vehicle was likely calculating out the last 50 to 100 miles of that vehicle probably sitting somewhere else being reviewed by somebody else and just kind of hanging out. So even if the firmware was finalized, that truck probably wasn't being driven very much on the road at this point in time. And you have to kind of keep that into consideration when you're looking at those numbers. My purchasing decision, I would never buy something based on speculation of what somebody said on YouTube on a very preliminary video, especially as the manufacturer is saying, no, we're still sticking with the 300. It's important to realize that if you're spending $60,000, $70,000 on a vehicle that you're probably going to own for 5-6 years, whatever the case may be, it's probably important that you make that purchasing decision based as much around fact that you can find as opposed to some sort of wishful thinking because you saw it on one YouTube video somewhere. And that's the same with the Cybertruck and the Rivian. Right now, these vehicles don't really exist. They haven't been tested. So I would just tread cautiously on how people are hearing things and then restating them as fact when ultimately none of these vehicles have been tested at all or independently verified by any sort of independent agencies or Consumer Reports or independent YouTubers. So to wrap this video up, again, I'm not trying to trash MKBHD. I understand what he did was a first impression. I don't think he tried to really sell it as anything else on that. But I do think for right now, if I were to give him any sort of pointer, I would probably cut that part of the video out, which you can do in YouTube Studio, just because I think it's causing some confusion, and it's also causing confusion that theoretically people may not hear from that video and make a buying decision, but they may hear, kind of the game of telephone where by the time it gets to, it's been filtered out through 6 different sources that the Ford F-150 Lightning gets 500 miles of range, and then somebody goes out and makes that purchasing decision based on, I guess the root of the bad information. So I would like to see that part of the video cut out, or even maybe another video produced where it's clarified a little bit better that, again, it was just a first impression, general rough shot idea. That just comes down to YouTuber responsibility, in my opinion. And if I were to do something similar and somebody had a problem with it, I would hope that somebody would try to call attention to it so that I could maybe try to rectify it. It's kind of a part of, I think, keeping the community honest and keeping the content on the platform as reliable as we possibly can. None of us have, or most of us, I would say, including MKBHD, probably don't have a whole team of people vetting content and fact checking and things like that. So I think it is a bit on the community itself to do a bit of that fact checking. So that's kind of what the intent of this video was as I'm testing out my cooler case in this 100-degree garage. By the way, this camera would have easily shut off by now, and it's still rolling strong. So I think I have a winner here. This video will be coming out with the camera cooler case probably later in the week because I'm pretty proud of this little contraption that I built. So thank you guys very much for tuning in. Again, if this is your first time tuning in, please hit that subscribe button down below. Remember, likes go a long way to help support the channel. I'll see you guys next time.